All right, now we are back to finish up, or at least move along, in chapter 2 by talking more about the anatomy of the central nervous system. Spinal cord, as we have already noted, is part of the central nervous system. And there's really not a lot to say about it because it's primarily, as it listed here, it's a relay between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. And that means sensory signals coming in from the peripheral nervous system are relayed up to the brainstem and onto the brain. And the motor signals, sometimes referred to as ascending and descending, right? So the sensory signals are ascending. The motor commands are descending from the brain out to the nerves. This is all part of the somatic nervous system, right? The sensory and the motor nerves. We also find, though, that there are some motor neurons within the spine that help regulate reflexive actions. So that's an important role of the spine to do some of these really basic simplistic movements that we find in the body. Further up above the spinal cord, we find the brain stem. This includes primarily things that relate to the autonomic nervous system. So remember the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system regulating either the rest and digest or the arousing part of the fight or flight response. A lot of that happens within the brain stem, though some other higher level areas get involved as well. So we see that in the hindbrain. The midbrain plays a role in helping to transmit sensory information further up the brain, as well as play some role in helping to regulate arousal within the brain and body. Sitting above the midbrain is something we'll call the diencephalon, which I had noted in the previous video was some of the other subcortical structures. And then above all of that, we find the forebrain itself, which consists of the cerebral cortex and the corpus callosum connecting the two halves of the cortex. So let's see here. Let's find it. There we go. Next slide. So first up, let's talk about the hindbrain a little bit here. So evolutionarily, I guess we could say this is the most primitive part of the brain. It includes the cerebellum, reticular formation, the pons, and the medulla. Right. So those four parts are really important parts of the hindbrain. It's worth pointing out that the reticular formation spans further up the brainstem into the midbrain as well. So kind of goes across both of those parts of the brain. As noted here, some of the basic functions of these are the cerebellum helps to play an important role in the timing of skilled movement. Something to think about here. Imagine, for example, you're reaching with your right arm across your body to pick up something that's more over on the left side of your body. So you're using your right arm to reach across your body when you do that. And so maybe do that right now. If you can see me in the video, you can kind of see I'm trying to do that, right? One of the things that you might notice is that as you perform this movement, you have at least two major joints of your arm that are working. Your shoulder is working to bring your arm across your body, while your elbow is actually kind of going and it's opening up, as instead of closing in the way your shoulder does, your elbow kind of opens up. And the result of these two joint actions is that it gets your hand moving in an almost straight line to whatever the object is, right? Not a perfect straight line, but pretty close, right? And so in order to get the hand, and that's a very efficient movement, right? Instead of taking some long, winding, curvy, roundabout path, your hand is taking the most efficient route to get to the object you're reaching for. But in order to make this work, that means that the muscles that control the shoulder and the muscles that control your elbow have to all be working at just the right timing relationship with each other. And that timing between the muscle contractions expanding all of these different joints, that's all regulated by the cerebellum. So even though the decision to perform the movement may originate in higher centers of the brain, and the choice to use your right arm to reach for the object instead of your left arm, again, will originate from higher centers of the brain. The actual execution of that smooth, well-coordinated and skilled movement is aided by activity here in the cerebellum that helps ensure that the structure of the timing of these nerve impulses that innervate different muscle fibers is all occurring at just the right time. Reticular formation, as noted here, helps relate sensory input further up from the brainstem up into the cortex, which is an important part of sleeping and waking, actually, because if we think about this, when we are asleep, we don't want to have a lot of sensory information going into the brain, right? Because that wakes us up. So the reticular formation helps keep us asleep by blocking out some extraneous noises. Obviously, something that's really loud or some other really salient, intense stimulus will get past this barrier, but it sets a threshold in a way, right? And likewise, of course, when it's time for us to wake up, the reticular formation gradually starts letting more sensory information in that helps us wake up. Below that, the pons and the medulla, as noted, are part of some of this basic parasympathetic rest and digest, just keeping the body alive and functioning kind of stuff. Here we can see that, right? We see the brainstem. We can see the medulla labeled there with the cerebellum sitting behind it, kind of sort of wrapping around the posterior of the brainstem. The reticular formation is highlighted there in red. It's kind of an internal structure. And as I said, spans not just in the hindbrain, but up through the midbrain as well, as you can kind of see in that picture there. Little detail about the pons here. That translates as bridge. So it's kind of a connecting bridge between the cerebellum and the rest of the brain. So it plays an important role in movement as well. And the medulla here, of course, is controlling all those vital functions. Now, as we go farther up above the hindbrain and we find the midbrain, in addition to including the reticular formation that I said earlier, these two important parts of the midbrain are also considered now very important for sensory and motor stuff. Tectum and tegmentum. So tectum refers to roof and tegmentum refers to floor. And so the top roof of the midbrain is the tectum, receives visual and auditory inputs. But what's interesting here is that these visual and auditory inputs are not necessarily exactly part of the pathways involved in conscious vision and conscious hearing. Think of the auditory input for a second. A lot of times, if we were in a classroom, what I might do, for example, is make a loud noise by banging on the desk. And usually what happens is that in a sudden loud noise, everyone lifts their head and turns in that direction to see what was that, what's going on, right? That's an orienting response. And it's basically a reflex, right? And so one of the things that's happening in the tectum is that sudden loud sound directly triggers a movement of your neck muscles in the direction of the sound so that you turn your head in the direction of the sound source. Of course, how do you know what's the direction? How do you know the sound is coming from the left side or the right side? Well, as it turns out, a sound coming from the left of your head arrives at your left ear a fraction of a second before it arrives at the right ear. And that difference in the time of onset of those two sounds to your ears, it might be very, very small, but it's detectable. And it's in the tectum that this happens, right? The signals coming from the two ears are being compared in terms of their timing. So if the signal coming from the left ear is coming in a little bit sooner than the right ear, that tells the tectum that the sound is somewhere to your left and you're going to rotate your head in that direction. And the same goes for the control of blinking with your eyes. So a visual input that says something's coming at my eye, I need to blink. That's happening with that sensory input coming in from the visual part in the tectum, right? Now, what's going on with the tegmentum? So we have a little bit more movement stuff happening here, connected up with the pons and the cerebellum and stuff like that. Notice that I have listed here species-specific behaviors. And so remember when we talked about in the previous chapter, this issue of instinct and fixed behaviors, things like the herring gulls and the chicks that peck on the when they see the long yellow beak with the red dot. And in that case, again, that's a very basic, primitive, instinctual level response. Don't need a lot of higher level cortex for that. This can be regulated through these brainstem kind of structures. Pain pathways also pass through the tegmentum as well. So these are part of a special series of nerve paths that travel up the spine, processing pain information. Here we see some cross-sectional views of the midbrain. And so you can see first down at the bottom of this here, we can see the organization of the midbrain there with the tegmentum below the cross-section plane and the tectum above. The tectum includes the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. And so, of course, this is where we talk about those visual and auditory inputs. So the information from the eyes to help regulate blinks and eye movements to look in different directions, that goes to the superior colliculus. And the auditory information that helps those orienting responses, that goes to the inferior colliculus. In the planar view here on the top right, we see the reticular formation, again, showing here, right? But other parts, including the substantia nigra and red nucleus, those are important movement-related pathways. So again, this idea of controlling movements is part of some of these nerve tracks here in the central nervous system. They would be tracks, right? The cerebral aqueduct is part of the system that contains the cerebrospinal fluid. Further on up above the midbrain, we find the diencephalon, and here we get the hypothalamus is an important part of this, right? There's a whole lot that we're going to need to talk about when it comes to the job of the hypothalamus. It's a fairly small part of the brain, but nevertheless a very important but somewhat primitive part of the brain. So it's connected to the pituitary gland, which you may know as the master gland of the endocrine system, but because it's connected to the hypothalamus, the pituitary is really also part of the brain. It's considerably fair to say that the brain is in fact really a part of the endocrine system. It's a gland of the endocrine system. The neurotransmitters used in the brain are essentially the same thing as hormones. So it's all roughly the same system. So we have a long list of some of the core behaviors that are regulated by the hypothalamus. So we can just leave it here as a list form for now. We will later talk about some of the specifics of these functions, but what we know is that they're small little nuclei, right? Remember, clusters of neurons embedded within the hypothalamus, and each one is a specific function. So there's a hunger on part of the hypothalamus that's regulated to controlling the activation of eating, for example. There's another nucleus that relates to sexual arousal. There's another nucleus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus that regulates our circadian rhythms. Why is it called well, we'll have to talk about the organization of the visual pathways to understand what the optic chiasm is, so that we can understand this is the suprachiasmatic nucleus. But it receives visual input as well, right? And that helps us because our circadian rhythms are tied very much to the patterns of sunrise and sunset. And so there's another role of visual input, not just to the midbrain, to the superior colliculus for regulating eye movements, but also here to the hypothalamus to regulate our sleeping and waking cycles. Above the thalamus would be the above the hypothalamus would be the thalamus, right? Hypo just means below, right? So hypothalamus sits just below the thalamus. One of the primary functions of the thalamus is really just a relay center for all of the sensory inputs coming up through the brainstem so that they can be routed to the appropriate cortical areas. So visual inputs are going to go from the optic nerve, from the eyes, through a portion of the thalamus, and then to the occipital lobe of the brain. And auditory inputs are going to come from the auditory nerve up through the brain, midbrain, and then through the thalamus to go through to the temporal lobe of the brain. And also the touch and pain information is routed to the parietal lobe of the brain. Some motor organization is also happening here, and also helping integrate between the sensory inputs and relay everything to the frontal lobe where we might use that information. Thalamus is playing an important role here to help different areas of the brain all communicate with each other. We got some pictures here that show us the hypothalamus and also the thalamus just above it. That picture of the hypothalamus here on the left, you can see the pituitary kind of dangling down below it. And interesting way to try to capture here this idea that there are these little different chunky parts of the hypothalamus, if you want to call it that, but those would be those nuclei that do different jobs related to eating or sleeping and things like that. And then if we try to look above the hypothalamus in some of these other pictures, we see this other kind of a bun-shaped organ there of the thalamus, right? And we see that it's labeling here just the auditory and the visual inputs. The auditory pathway of the thalamus is known as the lateral geniculate nucleus, or LGN, and the auditory pathways in the thalamus are called the medial geniculate nucleus. And again, remember here that a nucleus refers to a cluster of neurons in the central nervous system that are all doing a specific job. So in this case, the LGN is a nucleus that handles the visual pathways, and the MGN is a nucleus handling the auditory pathways. And then finally, we make it to the forebrain, which most importantly contains what we'll call the neocortex or new cortex, right? The most advanced part of the brain, that where we find all of the action, so to speak, right? The higher level cognition. But we also find, importantly, the basal ganglia. So mixing up our terms here, it's called here, they call it ganglia instead of nuclei. But these are important structures for kind of regulating movement, sort of like, as I had mentioned with the cerebellum, kind of handling some of the very basics of how the movement is executed. That's what the basal ganglia also do. And famously, the limbic system is an important part of emotions and memory. So the amygdala, for example, and the hippocampus are part of the limbic system. We will learn about these again throughout the course, but here's a picture that helps us try to visualize, perhaps. We get to see the cerebral cortex, and we can try to imagine if the cerebral cortex was transparent, we could see right into the middle there and see that unusual shaped structure known as the basal ganglia, and that wrapping around on the underside of those parts of the basal ganglia, we find the hippocampus and the amygdala sitting very close to each other right there. I want to talk about the cortex. So as I said, we got the new bark, that's the neocortex. Cortex itself means bark. It's kind of like a layer or covering, right, on the outer part of the brain is why they call it that. So there are multiple layers of gray matter here, like so 6 layers of gray matter on the outside of the brain. That's the neocortex. This is where we get higher level perception and other conscious processing. But deeper into the cortex is where we find the limbic system, and sometimes it's referred to as the limbic cortex, right? It's a simpler, much older layer of cortex that handles some of the more basic processes, right? So regulating what we call approach and avoidance behaviors, which are related to, like, again, kind of like fight or flight things, but it's more at the level of conscious control of these things, right? So you might want to run away from a predator, approach a food source, approach a conspecific for mating. These things we call motivation-related behaviors, but we can subdivide them into approach and avoidance responses, and the limbic system plays an important role in doing that. Of course, we find this kind of behavior across the animal kingdom, whereas the neocortex, much more of an evolutionary modern development, is something we find in primates and especially here in humans. We also can subdivide the cortex into the 4 lobes, right? So occipital lobe, parietal, temporal, and frontal lobes. And here we see their functions are listed here. Again, we're going to dive into this in later chapters here to talk about exactly how vision is processed in the occipital lobe and how the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe works to process touch information from the body, and how auditory information is processed in the temporal lobe, and also how it manages some other visual inputs and memory and other taste and smell stuff, and how the frontal lobe generates movement and other higher cognitive function like working memory and attention. A lot of stuff is happening there. Here's a picture. Once again, I won't linger over these things. You can consult these pictures as needed to help you remember how to visualize the organization of the anatomy here of these 4 lobes and what their functions are. Something that we might also say about these different layers of the neocortex is that each layer has different kinds of cells that do different jobs. And some of these different layers are organized in different ways with different kinds of neurons that kind of map to different functions. We're not really going to get into the details of that here, but just as an important note, that there are different functions. So the reason we have these different layers in the cortex is because different functions are embedded within these layers, and there's kind of back and forth communication across the layers. So this is where we get this concept of what we might call a cytoarchitectonic map of the brain. What that means, cyto means cell, right? And architectonic just kind of means basically a structural map of where things are, right? And so this idea of trying to map things out based on the function and structure of different kinds of cells is part of a goal that we might do and this kind of research. So these are examples of cytoarchitectonic maps, right? What we're looking at here is a cross-sectional layer or view of these 6 layers of the neocortex, right? And we see they're a little bit different, right? So when we look at the motor cortex, so that motor cortex is that strip of the blue highlighted at the top there. That's part of the frontal lobe of the brain. And we see that there are 6 distinct layers when we do this kind of staining of a cross-sectional view of neurons, right? Take a slice out of that part of the brain and stain that so we can see. And we see that there's a differential distribution of neurons here, right? That looks like area 5 or layer 5 has a higher density compared to some of the others. And it's also thicker compared to, say, layer 4, right? Layer 1, on the other hand, is not very dense at all, right? And we see that there are different functions assigned here. There are integrative functions in layers 1, 2, and 3. What does that mean? Helping to integrate inputs, for example, from the sensory systems that come into layer 4. And then layers 5 and 6 send signals to other regions of the brain, right? Meanwhile, in the sensory areas, this is the somatosensory cortex and the parietal lobe, highlighted in pink at the top. This is receiving touch information from the body. Again, now we see 6 distinct layers, although they're a little more uniform in their thickness, although again, there's differential densities here. But again, we see this kind of same functional integration that the most outer layers are integrating signals from across the different other layers. And then there's an input layer, which is layer 4, and then there's output layers 5 and 6, right? So it's understanding the different functions and organization of these layers is an important part of understanding how these different areas of the brain do their job. Here is a list of the structures of the basal ganglia. It includes what's called the caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus. When we cover the chapter on movement, we're going to get into a little more detail about what these things are doing, but as noted here, it helps to control voluntary movement. Worth noting also that damage to the basal ganglia is, at least in part, something that we see in Parkinson's disease. So when a person starts to exhibit tremors that are a typical component of Parkinson's disease, one of the things that we understand of what the basal ganglia is doing is it helps to inhibit unnecessary movement. And the idea here is that when the basal ganglia begins to lose its function, that means we begin to lose the ability to inhibit those unnecessary movements. And that's when the tremors begin to emerge. Because typically, I guess the idea is that those tremors are really always ready to happen, but they are being kind of inhibited out so that they are not actually detectable and they're not actually performed. But once we lose that inhibitory control from the basal ganglia, they begin to become noticeable. Likewise, with Tourette syndrome, one of the particular hallmarks of Tourette syndrome are movement tics. Again, these kind of extraneous little movements, sometimes in the face, but can involve the hands as well, or head and neck. And again, these would be things that would normally be inhibited that because of some irregularity within the basal ganglia, they are no longer being inhibited. Of course, another common known component of Tourette syndrome are these little verbal outbursts that can sometimes include profanities. And so, the exact reasoning for that, I don't know if it's entirely well understood. I'm certainly not a neurologist. I couldn't tell you much about this kind of pathology. But again, the basal ganglia, its job is at least in part inhibiting these kinds of things. And when it breaks down, we see this stuff happen. All right, so in this sectional view here, in this frontal view, we're going to see a little bit of a better way of visualizing where the basal ganglia are within the white matter there, kind of embedded into the white matter. And that's in the center of that darker red coloring there, as well as the limbic structures of the hippocampus, primarily, we can see there coming in there. Also notice how the picture here is highlighting the substantia nigra. So that we had previously saw a portion of that within the midbrain, but it connects up from the midbrain into the basal ganglia because, again, that's part of an important area related to the control of movement. And in particular, this is the part of the brain that is often indicated as showing some damage in Parkinson's disease. The limbic system has these primary components: the amygdala, hippocampus, and cingulate cortex. So again, a very primitive part of the cortex itself. The amygdala plays an important role in some of those approach and avoidance behaviors that I had mentioned before. So some things related to sexual behavior, aggression, fear. The hippocampus plays a very important role in embedding new memories, and also spatial cognition and spatial knowledge and spatial memory is an important job for the hippocampus. Here we have some pictures that might try to help us visualize that. So as you should remember, parts of the way the basal ganglia kind of curved out and wrapped around. At the very end, we see the amygdala, and then attached to that is the hippocampus. It's kind of sitting medial to the temporal lobe, right? That is kind of closer to the brain's midline, inside the temporal lobe of the brain. And so the cingulate or limbic cortex is also that very primitive inner layer of the brain as well. A separate area of the brain worth pointing out, perhaps, is the piriform cortex, right? So here we have part of an important processing center for our sense of smell from the olfactory system here. So here we get a little close-up view on the right of the sensory receptors inside the olfactory epithelium of the nose, which connect up to some olfactory neurons that are part of what's called the olfactory bulb. And that comes back to the piriform cortex, which then transmits from the thalamus to the brain, where we can then be consciously aware of smells, right? I think what we want to do here is stop it again before we keep on going so that we have more manageable chunks of videos here.